The Fed put versus the government put, and how money printing actually works. And if you think this is going to be a review, if you're a pro out there, I would challenge you, wait until we get to the end of this video. I'm going to reveal some shocking insights that are definitely going to blow your mind. But I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1. We're going to go over the Fed put. We're going to explain this and what is quantitative easing. How does this work? The first thing that we need to do is define 2 terms, base money and broad money. So to do that, let's go right to Investopedia. The monetary base or base money is the total amount of currency that is either in general circulation in the hands of the public or in the commercial bank deposits held at the central bank reserves. In other words, bank reserves held at the Fed. Where broad money is a category for measuring the amount of total money circulating within the real economy. So base money and broad money. I want to point out before we go any further that this side of the whiteboard where we're dealing with base money, this creates the boom-bust cycles. This is all about the financial economy, where broad money is more about inflation, deflation, and the real economy. And when I'm referring to a Fed put or a government put, I'm just talking about a backstop for the stock market and asset prices. But it starts right here with the Federal Reserve and their primary dealer bank. We've got one here, and they're called Goldman Parachutes. I think you can guess who that is. So the Fed says, Goldman Parachutes, we need to buy some of your assets because we have to print up some funny money. We have to increase the base money supply. So before the transaction, the balance sheet of Goldman Parachutes has bank reserves and treasuries. The Fed has bank reserves, which are really just deposit accounts for the primary dealer banks and the banks under the Fed's umbrella. And they might have some treasuries, mortgage-backed securities or sausages, something like that. But after the transaction, what happens is Goldman Parachutes sells the treasuries to the Fed. Those go on to the Fed's balance sheet, onto the asset side. It's added to the asset side of their balance sheet. And to pay Goldman, the Fed prints up base money, bank reserves, and adds it to their account. So when we conclude the transaction, the Fed now has increased the size of their balance sheet. They now have more assets and they have more liabilities. The balance sheet of Goldman hasn't changed at all. They have the same amount of assets. The only difference is instead of having these treasuries, now they have additional bank reserves. In this example, let's say the Fed's balance sheet went from 5 trillion to 7 trillion. You see, it's increased in size. They've printed money, but it's only stayed in this financial economy. It really hasn't got out into the real economy. And editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of the Fed's balance sheet, and we can see, especially since the cerveza sickness, their balance sheet has been going parabolic. This means the amount of bank reserves or base money has also gone parabolic. Now it's time for a quick quiz. If this is all that happens, this asset swap between the primary dealer banks and the Fed, and they print $7 trillion, $10 trillion, $100 trillion of base money, and this is all that happens, how much does this affect the broad money supply, or how much does this affect inflation or deflation? Hopefully you answered 0. It doesn't affect it at all. The key is there has to be a transfer mechanism to turn these bank reserves into additional lending, therefore additional money in the real economy. The way I like to look at it is quantitative easing only adds balance sheet capacity to the commercial banking system. In other words, it gives them the opportunity to create more loans and more money supply that can circulate in the real economy. And if it does with velocity, then we potentially see inflation. But this is predicated upon two things. Number one, those banks have to be willing to lend into the real economy. They have to be willing to create more loans. And this is something that nobody really ever talks about, is the borrowers have to be willing to borrow. And if you're the average Joe out there and you're being hit with all these lockdowns from the cerveza sickness, there's a lot of uncertainty. Plus, you've got a $100,000 Ford truck payment that you're making. You've got a mortgage. You're sending all your kids to school. You really are just living paycheck to paycheck, although you might be making $75,000 a year. Does your personal balance sheet have any more capacity to take on any more debt? No. Therefore, the additional bank reserves just get stuck at the Fed, and that additional balance sheet capacity for the commercial banks doesn't do anything. It remains stagnant. Let's not forget the government needs inflation. They're the largest debtor in human history. They have to have inflation or they're going to flat out default. Those are pretty much their only two options. But how can they achieve this if the transfer mechanism is broken? This is why Powell always comes out and says that we need more fiscal spending, fiscal spending, fiscal spending. He's saying basically we need a government put, not only for the market to boost asset prices, but also to create this inflation so the government debt doesn't implode in the future, bringing down the entire house of cards. I always say the economy is built on three things: asset prices, debt, and confidence. So when we look at the Fed put or the government put, we need to look at it through that lens. When you understand they have to keep asset bubbles inflated and create inflation, everything that Powell says or the Fed does, it all starts to make sense. This assumes they're benevolent and they know what they're doing. And of course, that is a huge assumption. More on that later on in this video. Step number 2, the government put explained. This is when the Fed monetizes the debt. You hear that term all the time. Here's how it works. The government issues treasury and basically the Fed buys them directly. It's through a shell game with the primary dealer banks like Goldman Parachutes. But the bottom line is those treasuries end up on the Fed's balance sheets within minutes or sometimes days of the auction. So the treasuries go from the government to the Fed puts them onto their balance sheet, and to pay for those treasuries, they print up funny money or additional bank reserves. What's interesting are the banks, the commercial banks and the primary dealers, they have accounts with the Fed where they keep their bank reserves, but so does the Treasury, the government. It's called the TGA, the Treasury General Account. And it's just a checking account to hold these bank reserves, the exact same as the commercial banks. So since the treasuries have gone to the Fed is paid for those by increasing the amount of bank reserves in the TGA. The Fed's balance sheet has expanded, just like in step number 1. We can say it's gone from $5 trillion to $7 trillion. But now, instead of the bank reserves just being with the commercial banking system, just to reiterate, they're with the government, with the Treasury, and the TGA. Now we get to the point where things are a lot different than step number 1, where everything was contained in the financial economy and the base money supply. The government will spend the money into the real economy, let's say through infrastructure spending, maybe stimulus. So on this side where the broad money lives, the real economy, where we have to deal with inflation and deflation, it starts with the average Joe, just like you and me, having a normal bank account. Let's say he banks with B of B. It's not B of A, it's B of B. And of course, that stands for Bank of Bailouts. So Joe banks with Bank of Bailouts, and his account starts with this much in deposits. We'll just say that's $100. So B of B's balance sheet has bank reserves on the asset side that are held over here at the Fed, and the liabilities are the deposits that Joe has with the bank. But when the government gives Joe additional stimulus money, the deposits increase, or the bank liabilities increase. That's the way Jeff Snyder always says it. But to pay for the additional liabilities, the TGA sends the bank reserves to B of B. Because if the TGA just created more deposits, they'd be creating additional liabilities for B of B, but they wouldn't be giving them any additional assets. So they would basically make them insolvent. So we don't want to do that. So after the transaction's done, we go back to the Fed's balance sheet. The asset side still looks the exact same. They've got some mortgage-backed securities, and they have the treasuries they originally purchased from the government through monetizing the debt. They have the exact same amount of bank reserves. The only difference is now the TGA doesn't have any money in their account. In this example, it's got a lot of money in their account right now, over 1.7 trillion. But just for the sake of this example, we'll say the TGA spent all of their money into the economy. So the bank reserves that are liabilities with the Fed are the exact same dollar amount, but they've just changed hands. They've gone from the government to the commercial banking system, and that's reflected by the asset side of B of B's balance sheet. So what's happened is the base money has increased through this transaction, and the broad money has also increased by the government spending those bank reserves or creating additional deposit liabilities in the real economy. That's the big difference. When the Fed does quantitative easing, it's just with the base money supply. It's in the financial economy. But once the government put comes into play, when they start doing fiscal deficit spending, that means the Fed is most likely monetizing it. They're spending it into the economy, so it's creating additional base money, but it's also creating additional broad money. This is what most people consider money printing. And it gets really confusing because we use the term money printing to not only talk about an increase in base money, but also an increase in broad money. But I think most people, when they hear the term money printing, they think about it creating inflation. To make things easier to understand, we should really only use the term money printing when we're talking about the broad money supply. So the Fed technically doesn't print money. They only print bank reserves. Now there's additional deposits in the system, and what's been happening lately is those deposits are going straight into Robinhood accounts, like this one with Davey Day Trader, who's got a box of pizza and a computer. Of course, the only thing on the computer screen is the word buy. For obvious reasons. So they put this new stimulus money right in their Robinhood account, and they spend it into the financial economy. At the same time, people like Jaime Demon, who's Jamie's Hispanic cousin with his briefcase full of new money in excess balance sheet capacity, sees that there could be inflation expectations in the marketplace, so he goes straight into the stock market. So Davey Day Trader taking the deposits, going into the stock market, Jaime taking the excess balance sheet capacity, going into the stock market as well. So this government put recently has caused the base money to increase, the broad money to increase, and the stock market to go up as well. But it hasn't really created the type of inflation the government needs. At the beginning, in step number 1, there was a problem. They had a transfer mechanism that they couldn't get around. Well, now they've solved the problem of the transfer mechanism, but you still have the problem of velocity in getting these people to actually spend the money to get it circulating in the economy to create the inflation the government needs to pay their debt back with devalued currency units. But there's a problem. They still have to rely on Davy and Jaime to keep these asset bubbles inflated. What if we get to a point where Davy isn't stupid enough to continue to play ball and Jaime isn't greedy enough to play the game? And I realize that's not going to happen. Jaime's always going to be greedy enough. But you get my point. They still have to rely on things that are outside of their control. Step number 3, asset bubbles and inflation time bombs that you need to be aware of. These are things I've been thinking about the last couple weeks. They're not predictions by any means, but I'm just trying to figure out the probabilities. Check this out. First up is the inflation time bomb, and I go back to a podcast with my good buddy Eric Townsend on Macro Voices in his most recent interview with Dr. Lacey Hunt. And Dr. Hunt outlined how, in his opinion, he thinks we're in a deflationary cycle, but what would change his opinion dramatically is if the Fed started to spend money. In other words, if the Fed monetized the debt directly of the government, like we talked about in step number 2, and because of this relationship, we'll call it, the deposits in the real economy increase. Dr. Hunt referred to this as the Fed spending money. So it goes from just base money to affecting the broad money supply. This is the catalyst that he pointed to himself. I'm not putting words in his mouth, where he would go from a deflationary stance, not to inflation, but he felt we'd go directly into hyperinflation. And to hear him explain this in his own words, let's go right to the clip from the Macro Voices episode.
That does raise the risk, and you're correct to say so, that we change the Federal Reserve Act and we let the Federal Reserve print money. That's a real risk, and it's a risk that I am extremely cognizant of. But let me tell you this, we're going to make everyone extremely miserable in very short order. There are numerous cases of this. This was tried by Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s, the Germany in the 1920s. This was tried by Yugoslavia and Hungary at the end of World War II. There was a famous Bolivian case in the 20th century. And basically, it was the path that was taken by the Bourbons of France and the Romans and the Mesopotamians. They built up huge debts, which they could not service. And so take the Bourbon case, which is perhaps the most well-documented. They took on a great deal of debt to finance the French and Indian Wars, which was really a world war. It was in Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. Then they financed the American Revolution. Cost the French more for us to win the American Revolution. It cost them more for us to win than it cost us. And then they went into high living and so forth. And so what was the solution of the Bourbons? Well, to issue a worthless metallic coin. And eventually the inflation became extreme. And so going to money printing is an avenue, and it may be seized upon, but the result is social rupture and the collapse of the financial system. People will not want to hold financial assets. The whole world will be turned upside down, Eric.
Next, the bubble time bomb. And I'm referring specifically here to the stock market bubble. And this comes directly from Michael Green. I've been listening to a lot of his podcasts or his interviews recently. And if you haven't heard Mike Green on Real Vision or Grant Williams and Bill Fleckenstein's podcast, The Endgame, you've got to do so as soon as you get done with this video. I can't recommend it enough. And this is a massive oversimplification of what Mike talks about. And I think I'll do a video on it next week because it's absolutely fascinating. But it's the difference between passive investing and active investing. And now all of the money is now going into these passive investment vehicles like Vanguard. We'll call it the mega fund. Right now, let's say we've got 50-50 split between active managers and these passive funds. The way the active manager makes his or her decisions is through a qualitative or quantitative analysis. They use the balance sheet, the P&L, future cash flows, PE ratios, and macro analysis. Not so for mega fund. The only thing they use to make their decisions on whether or not they're going to buy or sell is if they have people that have invested in the fund saying, hey, I want my money back. Or if they have other people that say, hey, here's some more money. If the people want their money back, mega fund has to sell. If the people give them more money, mega fund has to buy. This is literally their entire decision-making process. But we've seen recently the trend towards more and more people going into mega fund because their fees are so cheap, and people like Warren Buffett say it's the best thing to do, and pretty much every single financial guru on YouTube tells you to do the exact same thing. Go into an index fund. It's the best way to invest for the average Joe and Jane. What happens if we go from 60% to 70%? And just as a thought experiment, what if we went to 100% of the investable assets for the stock market in the mega fund? It becomes this Thanos mega fund. It just controls everything. We have no more active managers that are doing the quantitative or qualitative analysis. The investors go to the Thanos mega fund and they say, hey, we want our money back. We want our money back. We're retiring. We're baby boomers. We've got bills to pay. The only thing Thanos mega fund can do is sell. But the problem is, who do they sell their stock to? Before, they'd sell it to the active manager at a certain price because he or she would do valuation analysis and say, okay, at 20 bucks, I don't like it, but at 5, I'll go ahead and hit the bid. Here, regardless how low the price goes, there is no bid. None. Because all of the assets are in the Thanos mega fund. So who would have to come in and hit the bid? Of course, the only player left in the game, the Fed. And as you know, right now, they're buying corporate debt, they're buying junk debt, they're buying mortgage-backed securities, they're buying treasuries like they're going out of style. All of these assets are going onto the Fed's balance sheet. So what happens in the future when the Fed becomes the only buyer or potential buyer of stocks when the people that are in the Thanos mega fund want to sell? The Fed ends up owning all the assets. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.